The date is July 14th, 1900, and in the foreign legations of Peking, ambassadors from the UK, France, Germany, and more are trapped in the foreign legations. They can hear the chanting of Chinese troops outside, the ringing of artillery shells hitting the walls of the embassies. But, little do they know, this will only be the beginning of a period of 50 years that will begin in the falling of an empire and the end of a system that lasted 2,000 years, turn into dreams of a democratic republic, and finally, after years of war, end in the rise of a communist dictatorship. This is the Chinese Revolution, Episode 1, The Boxer Rebellion. This series will be mostly about China's history between 1900 and 1950, but China was in the middle of a large-scale uprising that caused a huge war. So, let's give a quick rundown of the century of humiliation before the 1900s. As foreign powers began engaging with China, they began to seek concessions from China. During the First and Second Opium Wars, the UK had taken Hong Kong and Kowloon as a prize for beating China. Canton, which is now called Guangzhou, was now made open to trade along with other ports along the coast, but Canton was the main one. Other nations also got concessions out of China. In the 1890s, a rising Japan went to war with China in the First Sino-Japanese War. They won easily, causing Japan to take control of Liaotung and eventually Taiwan and Korea after a fight with the newly declared Republic of Formosa. Moreover, the realization that another Asian power could defeat the Qing in a war woke up China to the reality they lived in, and the Qing government rushed to introduce reforms. So began the 100 Days of Reform. This included importing guns and having British advisors train the military. However, most military divisions were still controlled by local governors. Armies had failed to develop away from flintlock guns and percussion-lock muskets, as the entire world at this time was realizing muskets were outdated, but no one knew how wars would be fought in this new world. China's emperor, Emperor Gangshu, had mostly been influenced by foreigners visiting Canton when growing up there, and telling of their homelands. Wanting to be like them, reform in industry, army, society, and politics began, and people hated it. This included Empress Dowager Cixi, who had already taken control of China twice over. She began supporting Gangshu's reforms, but eventually began to oppose it. Then, one night in 1890s, she sent eunuchs in to kidnap Guangxu, bringing her in control of China for the third and final time. Many in China agreed that reform was stupid and that the methods they were used for thousands of years would work fine. Many divisions would still use bows and arrows, which is funny because China was the one that invented guns. But finally, they did have a victory over Europe. Italy approached Cixi and asked for the Sanmen Bay. They saw, however, that Italy had no troops threatening them and no navy nearby, so she declined. This seemed like a victory to the Chinese, and in a way it was, but all it did was convince the Qing government that reform was a waste and that foreigners could be beaten back without reform, stopping any attempt to reform the empire. At this time, two groups began to emerge from Shandong province, a province that had been stricken with poverty after a particularly hard drought. These groups were known as the Big Swords and the Boxers. Eventually, these two groups merged into the groups known as the Righteous Fists of Harmony, but the West called them the Boxers. They started in Shandong, eventually spreading by hosting martial arts competitions in other cities. They would even challenge audience members to attack them during performances, telling them that they were immune to all harm, and that those who were hurt during the performances were not real boxers. Cixi realized the Boxers could soon try to take control of China for themselves, so she faintly supported the Boxers in 1899, but Boxer influence grew past Shandong, eventually encompassing all of China. Soon, on the last day of that year, the Boxers killed a British missionary, and when the news reached the British legation in Peking, the Qing made a statement blaming the British and claiming it was in self-defense. But they did hang 2 people for it and gave the British some money. However, violence was hard to avoid, and missionaries and Christian Chinese began seeing harsh treatment from other Chinese people. Railways were torn up and some stations were burned. The foreigners were asked for some help, but not much help arrived. However, though, in May 1900, British troops began making their way to Peking against the wishes of the Chinese. The Boxers were also on their way to drive them out. In late May, the Boxers entered Peking, with flags saying, "We fight by the order of the Emperor and for the salvation of the dynasty," recruiting more people and announcing that they were going to drive the foreigners out of China once and for all. The Boxers then burnt a racetrack, causing one of the foreigners to get killed. The next day, telegraph lines were cut, removing communication between the Peking International Legation Quarters and the outside world. On the 13th of June, the Boxers tried to attack the Austro-Hungarian legation, but the Austrians were such bad aim that they missed all their shots and believed the Boxers to really be immune to bullets. On the 14th, they tried to burn the British legation but were driven back. On the 16th, Boxers destroyed every shop connected to the foreigners' legations. The next day, they faked a message from the Europeans telling Shishi they wanted control over China's military, a raising of taxes, and restoration of Emperor Guangdong. Shishi was enraged and called for Chinese army troops to make their way to Peking and for the foreigners to leave. Some wanted to leave, but the Germans feared that they didn't have enough troops to protect them. Most wanted to keep waiting, but the German ambassador announced that he was going to the Qing court himself to ask for safe passage. However, he was ambushed and killed on his way. That night, everyone agreed that they would not leave, as now they knew what waited outside the walls. Meanwhile, along the coast, Admiral Sir William Seymour, commander of the British forces in the area, had received a message a day before the line was cut, convincing them that they needed to intervene. He landed a force of 2,100 British, Japanese, Russian, and Germans. However, they did not know what defenses were along the way to Peking or how far it was. They weren't familiar with the area. But they still pushed onwards, using a railway to take their supplies inland. The Chinese army was surprisingly okay with this and even helpful in some cases, but when the Boxers arrived, they began attacking the train and tearing up the tracks, slowing them down as they'd have to repair. Then, at Langfang, the Boxers completely stopped them in their tracks. When Shishi found out about the expedition, she ordered the Imperial Army to stop. Seymour's expedition began to turn back to Tianjin, but as they did, they found that the track was torn up. They'd either have to walk slowly and gruelingly to Tianjin or keep going. They decided to walk. As they were walking, they eventually found the Jigu fort, which, strangely, was nearly undefended. The soldiers took refuge in the arsenal, which contained a wealth of arms and ammunition along with some food, but realizing the mistake of leaving the arsenal undefended, the Chinese army surrounded the base, and they were in for a siege. Seymour's expedition had failed. On June 20th, 430 foreign civilians and 3,000 Chinese Christians were still stuck in the legation, right next to the imperial and forbidden cities, but Boxers were preventing them from reaching the cities and seeking help from the Qing government. They were already low on ammo, however. The next day, all forces were ordered to retreat to the British legation under orders from Captain von Tobman. This was based on false info that the Boxers were trying to break in. The order was reversed, but the Italian legation was lost. They replaced von Tobman with a British guy, Sir Claude MacDonald. The legation from Austria-Hungary and the Belgians were also lost that night. Then, they decided to destroy all buildings around the legations to prevent the Boxers from catching it on fire. However, they didn't destroy one, the Han Ling Academy, as it housed one of the most important libraries in the world with priceless information. Surely the Boxers would not burn down one of their most prized buildings. The next morning, the Boxers tried to burn down one of their most prized buildings, and most of the documents were lost, but some survived. It was basically like the Alexandria fire, but for China. The Chinese put up a sign announcing a truce on the 23rd of June, enforced by imperial law. Many took the opportunity to leave the legation, others stayed thinking it was too dangerous. Then, the next day, fighting resumed. More Allied ships arrived off the coast to meet and discuss what to do, taking the Taku forts just north of Tientsin, opening the mainland to an Allied landing. They also decided to capture some of China's most modern torpedo boats. And so, at 3 a.m. the next day, the 4th Taku Fort battle commenced, and after 4 hours, the forts were taken. The next day, 2 modern Chinese destroyers were taken as well, but later destroyed. The Chinese only found out about the landing 2 days later, but confidence grew in the Qing court after the message said that they were winning. This was written to please the Empress Dowager Cixi, especially because Seymour's expedition was almost gone. So, with confidence growing, on June 21st, China declared war against all Allied nations, which sounds like a dumb idea to do. That's because it very much was. Meanwhile, in Tientsin, the city also had a foreign legation and had been besieged for years, including future US President Herbert Hoover. Yes, that Herbert Hoover. But Taku Fort, I mentioned earlier, was able to get reinforcements, and on the 25th, a Russian force saved Seymour and his men at the arsenal, and on July 13th, they then invaded Tientsin, and failed miserably. But the Japanese broke the walls of Tientsin and were reinforced the next day. The Boxers then began to flee the city. The Westerners held on to Tientsin and for a few years, and when they handed it back to China, it was a completely transformed city. In Peking, things were deteriorating as well. On July 1st, Chinese troops made it over the wall. A combined force took back the wall. After the battle, they found the body of a rusty cannon. They decided to strap it to some parts and figured out that they used the right ammunition that they had. They named the cannon the Empress Dowager. Eventually, Chinese troops blew up the legation, but they didn't have time to storm in, as on July 17th, another truce was agreed upon, as the Qing court argued whether to finish them off. But as they bickered, Allied forces began to build. As they prepared, 70,000 and 100,000 Chinese Boxers blocked them. As they prepared, their force of 2,000 people received a message smuggled out of Peking that they were in desperate need. In reality, however, since July 17th, truces had gotten more frequent and they had been able to capture food and ammo from the Boxers. On August 4th, they began their march to Peking, finally, to rescue the foreign legations. On the 27th, the force met the Boxers and the Chinese army at Baikong. This was the most modern force in all of China, dug deep in trenches. The expedition charged, and they eventually made it after heavy fighting. The Chinese ran across a platoon bridge and sank it. Eventually, next day, Allies made it across the river and won another battle against the Chinese. Then, the reality set in that those armies Cixi had summoned back in June were not coming because the commanders thought the war was stupid and they wanted to fight the Boxers. Then, the Boxers and the Imperial Army basically collapsed, making way for the expedition to reach Peking. But as they did, coordination broke down and it became a race to see who would get there first out of national pride. And, instead of waiting for reinforcements, the alliance arrived at Beijing on the 17th of August. They decided to wait, but international rivalries began to take hold. However, once they reached Peking, it was relatively easy to enter, because other than the Imperial Army, there wasn't much defenses. Most of the Boxers were simply farmers that had joined, and so, most of them went back to farming. As the rest of the force was camping, the Russians decided they wanted to be the ones to rescue the foreign legations. So, in the night, they went for Peking, with the Japanese following suit. By morning, the rest of the expedition found them pinned under trenches just outside the walls of Peking. British and Americans made their way into Peking that morning on August 12th. They were held up in Peking by heavy street fighting, with the Americans caught in most of the fighting. Finally, though, the British made it into the foreign legations. The 55 days at Peking were over. The next day, 400 Chinese Christians at the Baitong Cathedral were also saved. They had been in an identical siege not far away. The people at the Baikong Cathedral were saved by the Japanese, even though it was the Russians' job. A breakdown in communication ensued, and most forces kind of went their separate ways. Also, during the rebellion, Russia invaded the Chinese region of Manchuria. Only in 1905 did they give it back after the Russo-Japanese War. They eventually made contact with the Chinese government, which at this point had fled south to Wuhan. They agreed to pay the Allies, build a statue of the German ambassador, and apologize to Western powers, and for the foreign legation to be reinforced with much more troops. China's century of humiliation would continue on for the next few years, but this was a lucky outcome, all things considered, for China. The same people remained in power at the end of the war, and modernization resumed. Basically, the whole rebellion was a big waste that achieved basically nothing. Western powers even still agreed to train China's military. The Qing were beaten back, but even then, another threat was rising. One that would eventually light the spark that would quite literally lead to a giant revolution. And with that, that was the Boxer Rebellion. This is only part 1 of the Chinese Revolution. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more of this. The next episode will be about the buildup of tensions in China and the cracks in the Qing government growing as the stage is set for a revolution.